Welcome, everybody. I'm Chad Wood. I'm a principal at Vienna International School and also the chair of the Inclusive Education Special Interest Group for ECIS, along with my colleagues Eleni, Martha, and Amy. And some of the things that we try to do is put together some useful webinars for different teachers, and this one is going to be very useful today. It's an important topic and one that we all experience in our schools, anxiety in the classroom. We've heard, the anxious generation go around in different books and different research recently, and so this really feels like an opportune time to hear from one of our experts. So I'm really looking forward to introducing Dr. Sherryse Corrow. Um, Dr. Corrow is a professor of psychological sciences and neuroscience at Bethel University in St. Paul, Minnesota, and a research specialist for Northshore Learning. She received her master's and Ph.D. in child psychology with an emphasis in cognitive neuroscience from the Institute of Child Development at the University of Minnesota. She also completed 4 years of postdoctoral training in neuroscience at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, with funding from the National Institute of Health. Dr. Corrow teaches courses pertaining to neuroscience, research, and statistics, and also as a faculty development specialist for the university. She is passionate about bringing evidence-based information into the classroom, making neuroscience accessible to everyone. So thank you, and without further ado, please take it over, Dr. Sherryse.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here and to have so many people that are ready and thirsty for this information because, as you pointed out, it's a very prevalent thing. We're all experiencing anxiety in the classroom. I think at every age group. So it's a really important thing that we're going to be talking about. One thing that I really want to emphasize is this is really kind of a snapshot of what would be more like a full day or multi-day training on trying to think about these kinds of things and the practical implications as they affect our work with kids in the classroom or even young adults. So with that said, I do have a Padlet here. I would like to see a little bit more about all of you who are attending this call. So there is a link, the fairly simple link that you can hopefully type in if you'd like to do that, or you can use a phone and the QR code to jump into this space. As I introduce myself, I would love to see on my phone kind of who we have here. What grades and subjects are you teaching? So just a little introduction to yourself would be wonderful. And as you're doing that, I'll tell you a little bit more about myself. You already got a great introduction to me, but I actually started out in early childhood education as a preschool teacher. So that was my first introduction to the world of teaching when I was, I don't know, it was in my young 20s. And I received my PhD in child psychology with an emphasis in cognitive neuroscience from the University of Minnesota. And then after that, I was really, really interested in the neuroscience piece of it. And so I went on to do postdoctoral training at the University of British Columbia. And now that I'm at Bethel, doing work here, I'm certainly teaching courses within the realm of research and neuroscience. I'm also teaching courses as they pertain to well-being, and really working a lot with our faculty development team. And then certainly have been serving as a consultant for Northshore Learning, which is what brings me to you today. I also have two children, Eleanor and Isadora, ages 12 and 4, as you see here in this picture. So they keep me busy when I'm not doing all these other things. Okay. So as I mentioned, I'm here as a consultant for Northshore Learning. Northshore Learning is a group that really focuses on helping schools thrive in the many versions that can take. So many different ways that you can get at the angle of how can we help schools thrive. So they provide workshops and trainings and support, focusing on things like student behaviors, student learning support, teacher well-being, executive coaching, and really in a worldwide kind of way. So they work a lot with international schools, but also working with public schools all over the world. So I encourage you to reach out to them if there's additional support that you need, and I'll also provide some resources at the end to let you know what kind of work they're doing. Okay, so I want to start off with why am I here? Why are we talking about the anxious generation? This is something, I mean, in some ways, I feel like I don't need to tell you why I'm here. I think teachers, they know this, right? This is an anxious generation. So this is data that's out of the Center for Disease Control. So this is very US-centric data, but it's very reflective of the kinds of trends that are being seen all around the world. And so when we're looking at things like depression, anxiety, and behavior disorders, the rates of these things are pretty high, especially once we're looking into the 6 to 11-year-old group and then further into the 12 to 7-year-old group. I mean, 6 to 11-year-olds, more than 6% of them in 2022 in the United States were reporting diagnosable levels of anxiety. But by the time you got to thinking about 12 to 17-year-olds, now we're talking about more than 10% of students are reporting really, really high levels of anxiety. So this is a real thing. This is it's a very it has very direct implications for the kinds of things that are going on in the classroom. And it's something that we need to be talking about. This is really important, both because it has implications for the way that the classroom is running, but also because it has implications for the child, right? If a child is consumed by anxiety, they're not in a place where they're going to learn well. And so being able to think both about classroom management, but also in individually for each child, how can we make sure that they're learning and getting the course content as best as they can so that they're prepared for the next thing to come. So what I'd like to notice, so I want to take a look at my Padlet really quick here. So you're seeing we've got 6 to 12, we've got consultants, we've got grades 3 through 5. We've got quite a range here. Preschool, International School Geneva, year 6, K-5. So quite a lot of people looking at younger groups, which is great. So thank you for putting in that information for me. I would also be really grateful if you would turn your attention to the second question, which is, what are you noticing in the classroom? Okay, so I'm curious what kinds of things that you're noticing as they pertain to anxiety in the classroom, if you could jot your thoughts down into that box, and I'll maybe just give you like a minute to do that quickly. I'll talk a little bit about responses as they come in. Okay, so we've got a couple of responses coming in here. We've got Chad saying, noticing that students are more anxious than in years past and wondering the degree to which screen time is playing a role in those things. Children who are easily frustrated. Yes, absolutely. Children who are scared to make mistakes. Children who who do not put effort into pretty much anything, right? So the anxiety realm, we're referring to this as avoidance. So I'll talk a lot about that in a bit. I have a mood board at my door where students have to point out before they enter their room. Some of them come worried and scared when they have an assessment. Yep. Let's see, anxiety around social interactions and friendships, feelings, things like that. Post-COVID, yes, extreme anxiety that seems to be connected to physical health, at least in some realm. Oh, yep. The need to control everything. Isn't that the truth? Especially in a kind of post-COVID world, I think there's an increase in the desire to keep things under control. Anxiety when routines change, things like that. So one of the reasons why I put these things into the Padlet is just so that you guys can see the kinds of responses that other people are giving. You're not alone, right? Like these kinds of pieces of anxiety are showing up in the classroom, and they're showing up all over the world. So that's what this is going to be about. As I mentioned, this kind of thing is usually kind of, my presentation is usually a bit more interactive, but I'm trying to pack as much as I can here into this 1 hour. So bear that in mind, and we do offer kind of longer versions of this that have a bit more applied and allow you to kind of dig in a little bit more about how things apply to your particular spaces that you're working in. So Thank you very much for sharing your reflections on what you're noticing in the classroom. So the objectives for this presentation, first I want to just spend a little bit talking about kind of the basics of how anxiety works from a neuroscience perspective. Then we're going to take that information and really move to a kind of a more applied approach of thinking about how can we address anxiety in the classroom through positive relationships, through emotional regulation, and by providing a safe environment for students. Okay, so let's start off then with the concept of how does anxiety work? All right, so I have what might seem like a very strange video for you here. This is an organism called an aplysia, and it's often used in neuroscience because it has a very, very simple nervous system. And so it just kind of boils things down to the very nitty gritty. But what I want to demonstrate to you is how the aplysia reacts to a stressful situation. So what you're going to notice in this video, and I've been told the video is not very loud, but it actually doesn't matter too much for the purpose of the video. So we have like the tail of the animal, the gill right here, and the siphon, okay? And what they're going to do is first they're just going to kind of touch the animal, and you're going to see that in a fairly protective way, this aplysia kind of retracts its gill just a little bit, like, hey, what was that? Okay. But then they're going to come in and they're going to provide what they call a noxious stimulus. So they're going to give the animal a little bit of an electric shock. And what I want you to notice is what happens to the gill when they do that. And then they're going to talk a little bit about what happens if they continue to do it. So watch this video with me.
So we're looking at a aplysia stretched out. We're going to focus in on the gill and the siphon. We're going to apply an extremely weak stimulus so you can see the amplification with sensitization. Weak stimulus to the siphon, you see modest withdrawal. Now we're going to frighten the animal, startle it, the noxious stimulus to the tail. That, of course, causes contraction. All right. This contraction lasts for seconds, but you can come back minutes later. The same siphon stimulus now produces a much more powerful withdrawal. You can now compare the two, normal and sensitized, and see how much more powerful the withdrawal is in the animal. The memory for this event is a function of number of training trials. So if you give a single tail shock, plotting here, change in reflex strength is a function of time. The enhancement of the reflex lasts minutes. But if we give the same stimulus 4 or 5 times, we get a memory that lasts a couple of days.
Okay.
So we have a short-term memory and a long-term memory.
Okay, so this is Eric Kandel. He received a Nobel Prize for this work on really plotting kind of information that we know about memory and about learning in very simple organisms. But what I want to point out is kind of how this relates to anxiety. So this is a fear response. There's an actual negative stimulus that's happening here. And so the way that I want to frame this is thinking about first beginning with a trigger, right? So in this case, this poor aplysia is being exposed to an electric shock. So that's the trigger for this animal. Okay. And as a result of that trigger, we get a behavior, right? In this case, the behavior is the gill retraction. Like it's trying to protect itself because there's a painful stimulus that's present. Okay. And then as a result of that behavior, there's some degree of reinforcement that's happening. Because the gill is retracted, the animal now feels better protected from that harmful stimulus. Okay. And as Eric Kandel pointed out in the video, as this continued to happen, like if they continue to provide a noxious stimulus, then, and they did it over, several times, then that gill retraction stuck around for many days, which is pretty incredible in an animal with a nervous system that's really, really simple, right? So even this tiny, tiny animal with this very simple nervous system, its nervous system is working as what I call a prediction machine. It's making a prediction about what's likely to happen in the future based on past experience. Okay, so let's apply this then to the concept of anxiety. Okay, so and actually first, what I want to point out before I go into more examples is that this is an adaptive survival response, right? This aplysia is trying to survive, in the context of a situation in which it's being harmed, okay? That's really important. Fear and anxiety, generally speaking, these are things that we need to have. If we don't have them, we have a problem, right? So I don't want to think too much about anxiety as being an all bad thing. We actually need anxiety. It's important for survival. However, there's times in which anxiety can become maladaptive. It's not always maladaptive. It can be adaptive. But when it gets to the point that it's interfering with everyday life, it's really persistent, it's causing problems in our functioning, that's when anxiety becomes a maladaptive survival response. But it's still a survival response. Okay. So let's apply this concept now to general anxiety. So let's say that we have, and there's lots of different ways in which general anxiety can play out, but let's say that we have a trigger for a particular person, which is lots of people or loud noise, something like that, that somebody finds particularly overwhelming, right? You might have kids in your classroom or students in your classroom who are kind of really overwhelmed by a lot of people or loud noise. Okay? The behavioral response to that situation might be avoidance of it, right? Like, I don't want to be here. I want to go to a different space. And why? Because, well, when they've done that in the past, it leads to a short-term reduction in their discomfort, right? And as a result of that, the behavior gets reinforced, right? Like, this environment is scary for me. If I avoid the situation, right, I start to feel a little bit better. And therefore, I'm going to continue to avoid in the future. Right? So it becomes kind of a little bit of a cycle where first you have some sort of avoidance of a trigger. Okay? So avoidance, I promise, was going to be a big word in this. Right? And as a result of that, you have short-term and immediate reduction in anxiety. Right? It's like, oh, I avoided and now I feel a little bit better. And as a result of that, the avoidance gets reinforced and therefore that original behavior gets increased, okay? Where the behavior was avoidance. Okay? And so it kind of goes round and round and round. Because the behavior gets re-increased, they start to avoid more in the future. And then that avoidance leads to a short-term, and I emphasis on short-term reduction in anxiety, right? Which then leads to more avoidance, round and round again. Okay. So let's apply this to the idea of a panic attack. Okay. So let's say that we have an individual who at some point in time was driving down the road in their car. And for whatever reason, something triggered a panic attack in that situation, okay? Because panic attacks can happen fairly randomly. So they're triggered by this panic attack. And that trigger then for them going forward is just the thought. Even the thought of I might have a panic attack can be triggering in and of itself, okay? So what ends up happening then is in the future, this individual might be like, gosh, I had a panic attack while I was driving. I don't want that to happen again because a panic attack is a really, really terrible feeling. Therefore, going forward, I don't want to get in the car, right? That seems really scary to me. So then what might happen then is then they don't get in the car, they don't have a panic attack, and then that again gets reinforced, okay? So it's kind of a continuation of this going again, round and round again. You can apply the same kind of logic to a situation of trauma. Right. So you might have, for example, I have permission to use an example from a student. So I had a student who had been sexually assaulted by a male. And so for her, males in general have become fairly triggering, particularly males who look a little bit like her assailant. Okay? And so she's triggered by males now going forward. And therefore, as a result, she has avoidance and freezing behaviors in the context of males. Okay? That avoidance provides some reinforcement because her reaction is basically this: when she avoids, she gets that reduction in her discomfort, that kind of like, whew, I'm safe. And it's sort of like, it was a good thing I avoided. Now I'm still safe. That was a close call, but I'm good. And therefore that avoiding behavior again gets reinforced and continues to happen more again in the future. Okay. So taking all that into account, I just want to focus a little bit on kind of the neuroscience behind this and how anxiety applies to the brain. Okay, so we have sort of like a safety system, and I just want to emphasize that this is the anxiety system and our stress response system is very complex. There's many pieces to it. It's convoluted. So I'm boiling it down to a little bit of the nitty gritty here. Okay, so first of all, in our brain we have the amygdala. And you can think about the amygdala as being sort of like an alarm. It's a threat detector. Okay? And so when that alarm system gets triggered, it's telling us there's something dangerous that's happening in our environment. It's very automatic, it's unconscious, and it leads often to like this initial kind of react first, think later type of response. Okay, so if you think about this in a very much more primitive kind of way, you're in the savannah and you notice, okay, there's a tiger or something like that. This is going to make your amygdala go, ooh, you need to vacate this situation. Okay, and you're reacting quickly before you think much about it. Okay. But that's going to lead to some level of action. And a lot of this action is sort of originated by our brainstem. So our brainstem is really putting our body into action. It gets this signal from the amygdala, and all of a sudden, boom, you have increased heart rate, you have rapid breathing, and it's preparing your body to act. Okay. And it's really important that we have that system, because when there is a genuinely really threatening stimulus, it's absolutely essential that we are ready to act. Okay. But then we also have kind of what we might call like a cognitive appraisal of the situation. And so this is happening in our cortex. So more commonly, we think of this happening in our prefrontal cortex. And this is what some might call like the thinking part of our brain. This is the part of our brain that's now assessing the situation. This is where we have a chance to reflect a little bit, like, is this a real threat? Is this a false alarm? Is that a real tiger? Does the tiger notice me? All sorts of those kinds of things. So there's an assessment that's happening. And then that system then is going to feed back to the amygdala, right? And the whole system is now working together to promote a reaction to it of either maybe flight, like I need to run. I realize I meant fight for that first one. I need to fight, flight, or a freeze response. Okay. And as a result of that, there's hormones released. So hormones produce a much like kind of slower but more long-lasting reaction to a threatening situation, which then can kind of maintain a physiological response. And it also leads to learning and memory in the brain, so that all of this can be taken into account in future situations that bear some similarity to the situation that you're experiencing, whatever that threat might be. Okay? So there's a whole system involved, a very important system that's designed to keep us alive. So how can we think about this then in terms of trauma? So we can boil down trauma to thinking about it in a couple of ways. So one would be like a simple trauma. Most of us at some point in our lives are going to experience some sort of simple trauma. So this is a short occurrence or a one-time event that threatens bodily injury or serious harm. So if you get into a car accident, that might be considered a simple trauma, after which you might feel a little bit uneasy about getting into a car, right? If you experience a natural disaster, that might be a simple trauma for you. But some people also experience complex trauma. So this is traumatic exposure that can be longer in duration and usually involves multiple incidences or an ongoing personal threat of some kind. People who experience domestic violence, something like that, that would be considered complex trauma because it's happening over and over and over again. Okay? And these traumatic experiences put us into survival mode, okay? That can lead to sometimes perpetual psychological overwhelm. Okay? And so what can happen, especially in the cases of complex trauma, when these traumatic events are happening over and over again, what the brain is learning, because as I mentioned before, the brain is sort of a prediction machine. It's taking into account this current situation and what's happened in the past to try to predict what's going to happen in the future. And it might be that the brain comes to the conclusion that, like, hey, our attempts to protect ourselves aren't effective. They're not working. Like, I still don't feel protected. And over time, that type of process happening in the brain can lead to really long-term structural changes, things like shrinkage of the hippocampus and things like that. So it's like the memory areas of our brain. And it can put people into a situation where they're a little bit in persistent fight or flight mode. Like their stress response system is sort of always on alert. And that can be a really challenging problem to deal with. And for these individuals, it can become really difficult to differentiate between threats. Like it can become hard to differentiate something that's a real threat versus an unlikely threat, to differentiate between something that's a big threat versus a small threat, because the system is starting to view a lot of things as a threat. Okay? And then, of course, that is what leads to anxiety. So when you get a case of severe perpetual anxiety, this is a person who's in perpetual survival mode. And that constant threat leaves this persistent feeling of anxiety that's hard to make it go away. And then, of course, one thing I just want to add is that with regards to complex trauma, with increasing childhood adverse experiences or just adverse experiences experienced throughout life, there's increasing psychological and social impacts for the child, right? And so adverse childhood experiences can range in so many different ways, from abuse to natural disaster to if you're living in an area of the world that's experiencing war or things like that. Having more and more and more adverse experiences then kind of also increases the developmental consequences, because the brain over time is learning, I need to be on alert in order to stay safe. So what does this kind of anxiety look like? Particularly trauma-related anxiety. It often shows up in the form of avoidance, right? So I don't want to do this thing. I don't want to go into this space. I don't want to interact with this person. It can show up in the form of nightmares or flashbacks. It can show up as intrusive thoughts or memories that lead to kind of difficulty concentrating. So I mentioned that a little bit at the beginning of my talk in terms of thinking about, like, if you've got somebody who's experiencing really intrusive anxiety, that's just kind of, it's hard to stop thinking about it. It makes learning really, really challenging. Hypervigilance, so an extreme startle response, is common in somebody who's a victim of assault of some kind, or scanning, checking behaviors. Panic attacks, difficulty sleeping, excessive worry, and even physiological symptoms. Like if you have a child who is asking to go to the nurse's office a lot, saying that they feel sick, it's probably that they do feel sick, but the origin of that feeling sick might be anxiety. So they might actually be experiencing nausea, headache, or other types of physical symptoms that are a manifestation of their stress response. Okay. Okay, so that's kind of part one, the neuroscience piece of it. But I do want to transition into part two that just kind of gives some practical strategies for trying to address anxiety in the classroom. And I want to focus on positive relationships, emotional regulation strategies for kids, and also providing a safe environment. But before I delve into those things, I do want to kind of tip my hat a little bit to cognitive behavioral therapy. And there's certainly lots of behavioral strategies that are very effective for people in different situations. So cognitive behavioral therapy is one that is very evidence-based and supported by research to be helpful in the alleviation of anxiety. Highly effective at treating anxiety in students. But I want to emphasize that there's other forms of therapy, like DBT would be an example that has been shown to be pretty effective in the treatment of anxiety, particularly in cases of trauma. But there is a problem, and that is this. I think it's captured well by this quote from a 2015 paper. So I'm just going to read the quote. It's important for children who experience trauma to receive therapy by qualified psychologists, psychiatrists, and or social workers. That should always be your first step. When you can refer a child to therapy, I think that's the way to go. However, many students and their families lack access, motivation, and ability to successfully participate in therapy and follow treatment plans. For most students, attending school is the most regular and predictable routine in their young lives. And so for this reason, I think it is really important that teachers are kind of armed with tools to reduce anxiety in children or student or older students who are experiencing anxiety in the classroom. Okay, it's not a substitute for therapy. I think making sure that students have access to those resources and referring them to those resources is really, really critical. But having tools in your pocket for the classroom is helpful too. So the first area that I want to focus on is just positive relationships and what that looks like. So another quote here: across studies in general, lower anxiety was associated with a broad range of positive and supportive teacher-student relationship characteristics, such as sensitivity, care, affection, warmth, and when students perceive their teachers to be helping, friendly, and understanding. Excuse me. Conversely, higher anxiety levels were reported in students who perceived higher teacher harassment and conflict, and when teachers were perceived as unfair and strict. This might not seem like rocket science, but I think it really reflects kind of something that can be hard to do, which is a shift in perspective away from thinking like, what is wrong with you? And instead thinking about, what is happening with you right now? Okay. And so I do think it involves a little bit of empathy and a shift in perspective in terms of what's happening with the child as opposed to what's wrong with them. So things that tend to not work well, appeals to fear, like if you don't stop this behavior, then this thing is going to happen. Invalidation, you're acting like a baby right now, this shouldn't be that big of a deal. Punishment driven or shame inducing responses tend to not help. Behavioral charts tend to amplify the anxiety. Loss of points or privileges, public corrections in front of peers, removal from the classroom, calls home, and suspension. And when I say removal from the classroom, I mean like in a more punitive kind of way. These are the kinds of things that historically have been exercised fairly often in educational settings, but have just been shown pretty consistently to not work well when it comes to dealing with kids who are experiencing anxiety. These are some things that have been shown that they do work well, and this is from a variety of papers across many different years. Unconditional positive regard, so assuming the best of them. And I think that's, again, these things often come from that perspective of thinking about what's happening with you right now rather than what's wrong with you, right? Number two, I think this is really important, holding high expectations for the child that don't necessarily accommodate, right? So not saying like, oh, hey, this is anxiety provoking for you. Okay, you don't have to do any of it, right? That would be accommodation. Instead, holding high expectations, but just really coming alongside of them, okay? And really tailoring that to the individual kid. Checking your assumptions, observing and questioning. Being a relationship coach for them, especially as they're navigating social situations. So when there is a negative interaction that might be happening between two peers, being willing to step in and help support that child in that situation. Provided guided opportunities for helpful participation in the classroom. So ways in which they can be leaders when that's within the realm of something that they feel like they can do. Expressing empathy and warmth, and providing a consistent sense of security. Like, so for example, if a student gets upset with you or they're feeling really anxious about something, it can be really powerful to say, like, I know that you're really upset with me right now, but I want you to know that like I'm still here for you. I'm not going anywhere and I'm still listening. Right? And sometimes that can be powerful. And it works on developing a relationship of trust. Okay. One little just cautionary tale that I like to just warn people about. So another quote here that I think is powerful. Defensive behaviors such as aggression, withdrawal, dissociation, and bullying can serve as protective strategies for children as a consequence of abuse and neglect. So when you are dealing with kids who have experienced trauma, particularly related to their interactions with other people, like an adult, they might have learned over time that when they get close to an adult, they get abandoned, right? And then that's painful. And so the reaction can be from students like, I don't want to get close to anybody anymore because I don't want to be left again, or I don't want to be abandoned again. And so as you try to show up and provide all of these kinds of kind of empathetic approaches that I'm describing here, you might find that students are resistant to it. They're like, no, don't get close to me because I don't get close to people, because if I do, I get hurt. So you might experience a little bit of that. Okay. Greeting students at the door. And so, sorry, I'm going into some strategies now, just some like little things. And this, I mean, I could give you a long list of things that you could do here. I'm just pulling a few little samples of ways that you can kind of foster this kind of environment. So greeting students at the door and calling them by name. It just very much has like a, you're important to me and I see you type of mentality to it. Okay? Another one is a 2x10 strategy. So 2x10 strategy is when you maybe have one particular student who's showing some behavioral problems in the classroom or high anxiety in the classroom. You choose that one student and you make a goal to have a conversation with that student 2 minutes a day for 10 days in a row. And in that time, you essentially let them talk about whatever they want to talk about. Okay. It's an opportunity to really learn their interests, but also learn their strengths. Like, what kinds of things do they like? And how can you use those things to create an environment where they feel seen and heard? It can be really helpful. Another thing that can be helpful, particularly potentially with like slightly older students, but it can work for younger students as well, is role playing a disruption. And so this is a very proactive approach. So role-playing a situation can help to practice really depersonalizing what's happening. Like it's not about you. It can be helpful for the teacher in terms of just practicing how are we going to implement this in a way that I can remain calm using short and simple language, but it's also practice for the child as well to practice identifying what is their emotion and then what can be done next about it. So the steps involved, if you role play this out, and it might be like role playing that's something that happens regularly in the past, right? And both you and the child identifying the behavior. And after you do the role play, check to see, did you identify it correctly? Affirm and validate the student's feelings. And that's useful, I think, because it helps them to know that should this happen again in the future, that validation is coming. Right? Assist the student in identifying reasonable choices or options for dealing with that anxiety in the moment. So it might be like, I'll give more in this talk, but it's, a deep breathing exercise or something like that. And then following up with the student afterwards to see what went well and what didn't. So you're basically just like practicing a situation that's happened in the past and having it play out in the way that you'd like it to play out in a moment when emotions are not so high. Okay. Just some other ideas, some proactive ideas, using behavior specific praise rather than just like good job, but really pointing out like, I really, really like how in that moment you took that opportunity to just step away and take some deep breaths. That was really, really great. Moving seating frequently. This one I'll admit I like get cut up on a little bit because I think moving seating frequently can be really great for some kids to encourage social interactions with their peers. For other kids, they maybe need that consistency. So I think you have to know the kids in your room, right? Like you know them best. Using cooperative learning strategies where kids are able to work together, and I'll give some more examples of that coming up too. And then in terms of reactive, so when the anxiety is happening, making sure that you're addressing those issues in private, not in front of their peers. Always, again, trying to assume positive intentions on behalf of the student. And as you can, try to involve them in the problem solving. Okay, this is a model from Perry in 2009, but then it was kind of used again in 2013 by Walkley and Cox. And they just kind of provide like a 5-step model, which I think is helpful just as kind of a reminder in that moment. I don't know, you like put it up on the wall or something. So 1, remain calm. 2, be attuned, like what's happening with the student, right? Stay present. Try to be predictable, especially if you've like practiced or rehearsed these things in advance. Then you go, okay, you know what, we've role played this. I'm going to be predictable right now. I'm going to do with this child exactly what I told them I was going to do. And trying really hard to not let the children's emotion escalate your own. Okay, can be tough. Sometimes easier said than done. Okay, the second thing I want to roll into is just regulating the stress response. Okay, so there's a whole stress response involved, things that I didn't even go into in my slides that involves things called the HPA axis, and so on and so forth. But there's quite a few different approaches that can help to regulate that stress response. And so again, I'm going to divide these into kind of more proactive measures, like doing them before the stress response is elevated, and reactive measures. So again, proactive measures. So sometimes drama-based activities can be helpful in helping students to identify emotions. So I already mentioned that a little bit in the role play that I already gave in developing the relationship between you and the student, but it also can be really helpful for helping the student to identify the emotions that they're experiencing, especially if you're doing it in a proactive way, because then they're a little bit calmer and they have a little bit more of ability because they don't have all these intrusive thoughts happening to think about like, what is going on with me right now? If you're working with slightly older kids, then maybe analyzing a text through an emotional lens can be helpful. So like using a highlighter to identify, okay, here's the emotional escalation, and then here's the emotional de-escalation. And how did that work? And did they do it well? And just doing some kind of metacognitive reflection on it. Like, what could they have done better? What strategies did this person use to de-escalate this emotion as it was happening? Okay. But then there's also reactive responses too. So when a child is in a place where their anxiety is high, I think it can be incredibly powerful to just help them to identify the emotion. Like, I get the sense that you're feeling sad. Is that true? Right? Because sometimes when we're in emotion, we don't really see it the way that it can be seen from the outside. So giving an opportunity to say, I get the sense that you're feeling sad can be helpful. And then validating that emotion. It's okay to feel sad that such and such thing that happened. Like it's okay to feel sad that your mom left for the day, right? But then giving reminders and things like that, that mom's coming back. Yeah. Another thing that can be used in both a proactive or a reactive way, and this is the kind of thing that really is beneficial to anyone, would be deep breathing techniques. Okay, so on the left is depicted box breathing. So box breathing, and I'll just take a second to talk about breathing. Breathing can be really, really helpful. Slowing our breathing down really has a pretty dramatic and very quick effect on our central nervous system. And so if you have a kid who's experiencing a high amount of anxiety, being able to slow down their breathing is probably the quickest and most effective strategy you can have for bringing that anxiety down. And so these are two that I like because in addition to being a slow breathing technique, they also involve some degree of attention. And so I feel like they kind of reduce some of the intrusive thought that can happen, like the thought that they don't want to be thinking. And so box breathing is when you literally like make a box in the air. I mean, there's different ways you can do it, but you make a box in the air with your finger where on the up you breathe in. And so you do that for 4 seconds. So breathe in, 1, 2, 3, 4, then hold the breath for 4 seconds as you go across, and then breathe out for 4 seconds as you come down, and then hold it again as you come across. And then you just keep doing that pattern. Okay. Another one that I like that isn't what you have to be careful about is making sure that they do it really slowly, is doing kind of a tracing of the hands. The reason that I like this one is because it also has a sensory element to it. Like as you're kind of breathing in and breathing out and breathing in and breathing out, you also have this tactile stimulation on your hand that's slightly distracting. Like it tickles a little bit, right? And so kind of slowly breathing in and slowly breathing out. This is something that you can kind of do together. So as an educator, you can make sure that you're going really slow and ask them to just match what you're doing. And the slower that you can get them to breathe, probably the better. Another approach that can be taken is movement. Movement can be, we know that moving of our bodies has an impact on our neurotransmitter systems that in turn has an effect on our stress response system. So doing something like yoga, so yoga in the class, there's yoga in the classroom videos that are really helpful. Sometimes putting something like that on can be helpful. Like if you're just noticing like, hey, anxiety in the whole classroom is a little bit high, or maybe even as a teacher, like, hey, my anxiety is a little bit high right now. Let's all do a little bit of yoga in the classroom, and that's just going to help reset the stage. Sometimes sensory items can be really helpful too, particularly ones that use movement. But just as like a side note, I didn't actually put in a slide for this, but sometimes exposure to something that's like particularly cold, like an ice pack, can be just enough of a sensory stimulation to kind of like slow down that intrusive thought a little bit, because you're focused on the fact that like, hey, this is cold. Videos that you can find on YouTube of things like Go Noodle that produce a lot of movement can be helpful. Cosmic Kids is another one that's similar to yoga in the classroom. And then even just like going on a nature walk, like getting outside and moving that way has both the benefits of movement, but also the benefit of the nature walk, right? And then finally, the last one I have here is a progressive muscle relaxation, which is basically just where you tense up muscle groups and then relax them in order. So you might like start with your feet, right? Like you're going to tense up your feet, you're going to hold that tense for a few seconds, and then you're going to let it go, right? And as you're doing this, you're kind of making sure that you're slowly breathing. And then you do it with your legs, and then you do it with your torso, and you kind of move up your body. Excuse me. So this kind of approach can be really helpful as well. And these kinds of things can be done both proactively and reactively. So if things are getting a little tense, you can either do this for an individual kid, or you can do it for the whole classroom. But there also you might find that like, oh, hey, at around 2:30 in the afternoon, every single day, things tend to get a little bit nuts in here. Anxiety is high. It's nearing the end of the day. You might be like, you know what, I'm just going to insert something like this every day, and it's just going to help us to reset us a little bit. So you can do it in a proactive way. Another thing I want to mention is just the effect of rhythmic patterned activities can be really helpful. So this just helps students to feel a little bit, they're both socially and in a sensory way connected with a group, right? So there's an element of cohesion to this that can be helpful. It's distracting, it's a sensory experience, and it has a social component to it. So singing songs together or playing a circle game, doing a drumming activity that everybody's participating in, or doing something again like Go Noodle, where there's kind of movement happening on a screen and everybody's copying that movement in synchrony with one another. That kind of stuff can often be pretty helpful for particular children. And then lastly, just thinking about a peace corner. Like sometimes you just need a little bit, I think we all know this, sometimes you just need a little moment to step away. And so these are some just examples of peace corners in the classroom. I know a lot of classrooms have these kinds of things these days. But I really like to also putting something up on the wall, like here's some strategies to solve problems. Okay, and some of those things might be intentional about addressing anxiety, like taking 3 deep breaths, or there might be an image to be used for box breathing or something like that, just as kind of visual reminders for children of things that they can do if they're feeling particularly anxious. Okay. And then the last thing that I just want to point out is the importance of a calm and safe environment. Okay. And so having a really calm and safe environment can be really, really helpful, especially in situations where the rest of a kid's world isn't calm and safe, right? So then school can become sort of a sanctuary of safety. So I have a quote that depicts that too. So the environment can be the first line of defense and set the stage for regulation to occur throughout the school day. Imagine as a student coming from a loud and crowded bus ride, navigating through a busy hallway with a school bell ringing, to a classroom where the teacher greets you by name with a smile, the lights are lowered, the room is organized, there's calming music playing, the schedule for the day is displayed in the front of the classroom with the expectations outlined for the beginning routine. All students thrive and feel safe in an environment where the expectations are clear, the routines are predictable and consistent, and students know what to expect. So, and my last point is just that ultimately these kinds of things really they're good for all people, right? Like I think about these things in my job, I look around my office, I'm like, well, yeah, I could do more to make this like a calm space for me. All of these things, when I'm feeling anxious, I can go out for a walk. And so, and as I mentioned too, as educators, if you as an educator, I'm like, I'm feeling anxious right now, that might be a great time to be like, you know what, we're going to switch up our schedule a little bit, and we're going to go for a walk. I do have some resources here available for you. So there's some that are links to particular trauma-informed school initiatives. There's also some focused on well-being and resilience in kids, some preventive measures that focus on behavioral interventions. And then there's also a podcast episode that just kind of highlights some examples of the kinds of stuff I was talking at the beginning from the Ezra Klein's show that really focuses on anxiety as a habit that can be unlearned. Yeah, great. So I have this QR code that I would be so grateful if you filled out here for me at the end. As I mentioned, Northshore Learning provides all sorts of resources. And for those who fill out this QR code, we will share some additional resources with you. So if you'd like them, please scan here. But even if you don't want the additional resources, I would be really, really grateful if you give me a little bit of feedback on this workshop. The things that were helpful for you and maybe the things that were less helpful. We're always looking for that kind of feedback, and also learning more about what kinds of resources you as educators want to be learning about, like what additional things that are you in need of right now. One thing that I really love about Northshore Learning is how they adapt to the needs of like what schools are asking for. And so we're always happy and attuned to that, I think. So I would really appreciate if you could fill out that QR code for me. So that's all I have for you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Corrow. That was a really great webinar. Definitely walking away myself personally, and I'm sure many of the educators on here with some great tips that we can implement tomorrow. So it's always nice when webinars are practical, and as educators, we're always looking for something like, I'm going to try that. So I've got my couple things that I'm going to try. So thank you very much.
Yeah, happy to help.
Yeah. I was going to pass it over to Sarah. Just, I don't know if you want to have a final word, but before, I just wanted to say, just to plug, we have the Inclusion in Action conference that's coming to Vienna International School, that is sponsored by ECIS. And so we're going to have many workshops just to kind of really dive into inclusion at many different lenses and UDL. So if you're interested, or if you're interested in putting in a proposal, the call for proposals just came out. So again, that's on the 23rd to 25th of October. So a big thank you again for Dr. Sherryse Corrow for being here with us today and doing this webinar. And thank you to ECIS for giving us this platform to provide free webinars for educators around the world. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Chad. I don't think I can add to what you've said, but Dr. Sherryse Corrow, thank you so much for this. I got so much out of the strategies you were talking about, and making lovely connections there with all of the information that you were helping us to understand trauma so much better at the beginning. That was really helpful. I've just seen something in the chat which says the link seems to be the editable version of the Google form, so I can't complete it and see all the responses. So
I will check that. I'm curious if they're referring to, oh, someone just said the link in the chat works. So there must have been a link dropped into the chat, if that's helpful. Yeah.
Great, good, just so that everybody's able to contribute there. But thank you so very much. It's really, really, really helpful session, and just changing that onus from stop doing that and all the sort of negative responses that we've perhaps traditionally come up with better understanding, and through that understanding being able to really impact positively the behaviors of a child. I spent some time this morning with a class of 10th graders, and just thinking about how some of those students 5 years ago, when I was in the school with them, were showing very, very anxious and very trauma probably induced responses, and seeing them these years later in an environment where they've been given a lot of positive behavioral modeling and support was just beautiful to see. And so you've brought it all together for me today, and I'm sure that for many of the people that are listening today, we're all relating on our own experiences. So thank you so very, very much, and we'll keep in touch. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me here. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye then, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.